this time I came to know an old man and his son who worked in a mews at the back of the Kennington Road. They were travelling toy makers who came from Glasgow, making toys and selling them as they wandered from town to town. They were free and unencumbered, and I envied them. Their profession needed little capital. With as small an investment as a shilling they could start in business. They would collect shoe boxes, which every shoe shop was only too pleased to give them, and cork sawdust, in which grapes were packed, which they also got gratis. Their initial outlay consisted only in the purchase of a pennyworth of glue, a pennyworth of wood, 2p worth of twine, a pennyworth of Christmas-coloured paper, and 2 two-penny balls of coloured tinsel. For a shilling they could make 7 dozen boats and sell them for a penny apiece. The sides were cut from shoeboxes and were sewn onto a cardboard base. The smooth surface was covered with glue, then poured over with cork sawdust. The masts were rigged with coloured tinsel, and blue, yellow, and red flags were stuck on the top mast, and on the end of the booms, fore and aft. 100 or more of these little toy boats with their coloured tinsel and flags were a gay and festive sight that attracted customers, and they were easy to sell. As a result of our acquaintance, I began helping them to make boats, and very soon I was familiar with their craft. When they left our neighbourhood, I went into business for myself. With a limited capital of 6p and at the cost of blistered hands from cutting up cardboard, I was able to turn out 3 dozen boats within a week. But there was not enough space in our garret for Mother's work and my boat making. Besides, Mother complained of the odour of boiling glue, and that the glue pot was a constant menace to her linen blouses, which, incidentally, crowded most of the space in the room. As my contribution was less than Mother's, her work took precedence and my craft was abandoned. We had seen little of Grandfather during this time. For the past year he had not been doing too well. His hands were swollen with gout, which made it difficult for him to work at his shoe repairing. In the past he had helped Mother, when he could afford it, with a couple of bob or so. Sometimes he would cook for us a wonderful burgoo soup, composed of Quaker oats and onions boiled in milk with salt and pepper. On a wintry night it was our constitutional base to withstand the cold. As a boy I thought Grandpa a dour, fractious old man, who was always correcting me either about my manners or my grammar. Because of these small encounters I had grown to dislike him. Now he was in the infirmary with rheumatism, and Mother would go every visiting day to see him. These visits were profitable because she usually returned with a bag full of fresh eggs, quite a luxury in our recessional period. When unable to go herself, she would send me. I was always surprised when I found Grandpa most agreeable and happy to see me. He was quite a favourite with the nurses. He told me in later life that he would joke with them, saying that in spite of his crippling rheumatism, not all his machinery was impaired. This sort of rhodomontade amused the nurses. When his rheumatism allowed him, he worked in the kitchen, whence came our eggs. On visiting days, he was usually in bed, and from his bedside cabinet he would surreptitiously hand me a large bag of them, which I quickly stowed in my sailor's tunic before departing. For weeks we lived on eggs, dished up in every form, boiled, fried, and custardized. In spite of Grandpa's assurance that the nurses were his friends and knew more or less of what was going on, I was always apprehensive when leaving the hospital ward with those eggs, terrified of slipping on the beeswax polished floor, or that my tumorous bulk would be apprehended. Curiously enough, when I was ready to leave, the nurses were always conspicuous by their absence. It was a sorry day for us when Grandpa was rid of his rheumatism and left the hospital. Now 6 weeks had elapsed, and still Sidney had not returned. At first this did not alarm Mother, but after another week's delay she wrote to the officers of the Donovan and Castle line and received information that he had been put ashore at Cape Town for treatment of rheumatism. This news worried Mother and affected her health. She still continued working at her sewing machine, and I was fortunate enough in obtaining a little work by giving a few dancing lessons to a family after school for the sum of 5 shillings a week. About this time the McCarthys came to live in Kennington Road. Mrs. McCarthy had been an Irish comedian and was a friend of Mother's. She was married to Walter McCarthy, a certified accountant, but when Mother was obliged to give up the stage, we had lost sight of Mr. and Mrs. McCarthy, and not until 7 years later did we meet them again, when they came to live at Walcott Mansions in the select part of Kennington Road. Their son Wally McCarthy and I were the same age. As little children we used to play as grown-ups, smoking our imaginary cigars and driving on our imaginary pony and trap, much to the amusement of our parents. Since the McCarthys had come to live in Walcott Mansions, Mother had rarely seen them, but Wally and I had formed an inseparable friendship. As soon as I was through with school, I would race home to Mother to find out if she needed any errands done, then race up to the McCarthys. We would play theatre at the back of Walcott Mansions. As the director, I always gave myself the villain parts, knowing instinctively they were more colourful than the hero. We would play until Wally's supper time. Usually I was invited. At meal times I had an ingratiating way of making myself available. There were occasions, however, when my manoeuvring did not work, and I would reluctantly return home. Mother was always happy to see me and would prepare something for me, fried bread and dripping, or one of grandfather's eggs and a cup of tea. She would read to me, or we would sit together at the window, and she would amuse me by making remarks about the pedestrians as they passed by. She would invent stories about them. If it was a young man with a breezy, bobbing gait, she would say, "There goes Mr. Hoppinscotch. He's on his way to place a bet. If he's lucky today, he's going to buy a second-hand tandem for him and his girl." Then a man would pass slowly, moping along. He's going home to have some stew and parsnips for dinner, which he hates. Then someone with an air of superiority would walk by. Now there's a refined young man, but at the moment he's worried about the hole in the seat of his pants. Then another with a fast gait would streak past. That gentleman has just taken Enos. And so she would go on, sending me into gales of laughter. Another week had gone by and not a word from Sydney. Had I been less a boy and more sensitive to mother's anxiety, I might have realized what was impending. I might have noticed that for several days she had been sitting listlessly at the window, had neglected to tidy up the room, had grown unusually quiet. I might have been concerned when the firm of shirt-makers began finding fault with her work and stopped giving it to her, and when they took away a sewing machine for arrears in payments, and when the 5 shillings I earned from dancing lessons suddenly ended. Through all this, I might have noticed that mother remained indifferent, apathetic. Mrs. McCarthy suddenly died. She had been ailing for some time, and her health rapidly deteriorated until she passed on. Immediately thoughts invaded my mind. How wonderful if Mr. McCarthy married mother, Wally and I being such good friends. Besides, it would be an ideal solution to all mother's problems. Soon after the funeral I spoke to mother about it. "You should make it your business to see a lot of Mr. McCarthy. I bet he'd like to marry you." Mother smiled wanly. "Give the poor man a chance," she said. "If you were all dressed up and made yourself attractive as you used to be, he would. But you don't make any effort. All you do is sit around this filthy room and look awful." Poor mother. How I regret those words. I never realized that she was weak from malnutrition. Yet the next day, by some superhuman effort, she had tidied up the room. The school summer holidays were on, so that I thought I would go early to the McCarthys. Anything to get away from the wretchedness of our garret. They had invited me to stay for lunch, but I had an intuition that I should return home to mother. When I reached Pownall Terrace, I was stopped at the gate by some children of the neighbourhood. "Your mother's gone insane," said a little girl. The words were like a slap in the face. "What do you mean?" I mumbled. "It's true," said another. "She's been knocking at all our doors, giving away pieces of coal, saying they were birthday presents for the children. You can ask my mother." Without hearing more, I ran up the pathway, through the open door of the house, and leapt up the stairs and opened the door of our room. I stood a moment to catch my breath, intensely scrutinizing her. It was a summer's afternoon, and the atmosphere was close and oppressive. Mother was sitting as usual at the window. She turned slowly and looked at me, her face pale and tormented. "Mother!" I almost shouted. "What is it?" she said listlessly. Then I ran and fell on my knees and buried my face in her lap and burst into uncontrollable weeping. There, she said, gently stroking my head. "What's wrong?" "You're not well," I cried between sobs. She spoke reassuringly. "Of course I am." She seemed so vague, so preoccupied. No. They say you've been going to all the houses and—" I could not finish, but continued sobbing. "I was looking for Sydney," she said weakly. "They're keeping him away from me." Then I knew that what the children had said was true. "Oh, Mommy, don't talk like that. Don't, I sobbed. "Let me get you a doctor," she continued, stroking my head. The McCarthys know where he is, and they're keeping him away from me. Mummy, please let me get a doctor, I cried. I got up and went toward the door. She looked after me with a pained expression. Where are you going? To get a doctor. I won't be long. She never answered, but looked anxiously after me. Quickly I rushed downstairs to the landlady. I've got to get a doctor at once. Mother's not well. We've already sent for him, the landlady said. The parish doctor was old and grumpy, and after hearing the landlady's story, which was similar to that of the children, he made a perfunctory examination of Mother. Insane. Send her to the infirmary, he said. The doctor wrote out a paper. Besides other things, it said she was suffering from malnutrition, which the doctors explained to me, saying that she was undernourished. She'll be better off and get proper food there, said the landlady by way of comforting me. She helped to gather up Mother's clothes and to dress her. Mother obeyed like a child. She was so weak. Her will seemed to have deserted her. As we left the house, the neighbors and children were gathered at the front gate, looking on with awe. The infirmary was about a mile away. As we ambled along, Mother staggered like a drunken woman from weakness, veering from side to side as I supported her. The stark afternoon sun seemed to ruthlessly expose our misery. People who passed us must have thought Mother was drunk, but to me they were like phantoms in a dream. She never spoke, but seemed to know where we were going and to be anxious to get there. On the way I tried to reassure her, and she smiled, too weak to walk. When at last we arrived at the infirmary, a young doctor took her in charge. After reading the note, he said kindly, "All right, Mrs. Chaplin, come this way." She submitted obediently, but as the nurses started to lead her away, she turned suddenly, with the painful realization that she was leaving me behind. "See you tomorrow," I said, feigning cheerfulness. They led her away, looking anxiously back at me. When she had gone, the doctor turned. "And what will become of you, young man?" Having had enough of workhouse schools, I replied politely, I'll be living with my aunt." As I walked from the hospital toward home, I could feel only a numbing sadness. Yet I was relieved, for I knew that Mother would be better off in the hospital than sitting alone in that dark room with nothing to eat. But that heartbreaking look as they led her away I shall never forget. I thought of all her endearing ways, her gaiety, her sweetness and affection, of that weary little figure that used to come down the streets looking tired and preoccupied until she saw me charging toward her. How she would change immediately and become all smiling, as I looked eagerly inside the paper bag she carried for those little niceties that she always brought home for Sidney and me. Even that morning she had saved some candy, had offered it to me while I wept in her lap. I did not go straight home. I could not. I turned in the direction of the Newington Butts Market and looked in shop windows until late afternoon. When I returned to the garret, it looked reproachfully empty. On a chair was a washtub half filled with water. 2 of my shirts and a chemise were soaking in it. I began to investigate. There was no food in the cupboard except a small half-filled package of tea. On the mantelpiece was her purse, in which I found 3 halfpence, some keys, and several pawn tickets. On the corner of the table was the candy she had offered me. Then I broke down and wept again. Emotionally exhausted, I slept soundly that night. In the morning I awoke to a haunting emptiness in the room. The sun streaming in on the floor seemed to heighten Mother's absence. Later the landlady came up and said that I could stay on there until she left the room, and that if I needed food I had only to ask for it. I thanked her, and told her that Sidney would pay all our debts when he returned, but I was too shy to ask for food. I did not go to see Mother the next day as promised. I could not. It would have been too upsetting, but the landlady saw the doctor, who said that she had already been transferred to Cane Hill Asylum. This melancholy news relieved my conscience, for Cane Hill was 20 miles away, and I had no means of getting there. Sidney would soon return, and then we could see her together. For the first few days I neither saw nor spoke to anyone I knew. I would steal out in the early morning and stay out all day. I always managed to get food somewhere. Besides, missing a meal was no hardship. One morning the landlady caught me creeping downstairs and asked if I had had my breakfast. I shook my head. "Then come on," she said in her gruff way. I kept away from the McCarthys because I did not want them to know about Mother. Like a fugitive, I kept out of everyone's way. It was 1 week since Mother had gone away, and I had settled into a precarious habit of living in which I neither lamented nor enjoyed. My major concern was the landlady, for if Sydney did not return, sooner or later she would have to report me to the parish authorities and I would be sent again to Hanwell schools. Thus I avoided her presence, even sleeping out occasionally. I fell in with some woodchoppers who worked in a mews at the back of Kennington Road, derelict-looking men who worked hard in a darkened shed and spoke softly in undertones, sawing and chopping wood all day, making it into halfpenny bundles. I would hang about the open door and watch them. They would take a block of wood a foot square and chop it into inch slices and put these slices together and chop them into sticks. They chopped wood so rapidly that it fascinated me and made the job seem attractive. Very soon I was helping them. They brought their lumber from demolition contractors and would cart it to their shed, stack it up, which took at least a day, then saw the wood one day and chop the next. On Friday and Saturday they would sell the firewood, but the selling of it did not interest me. It was more clubby working together in the shed. They were affable, quiet men in their late 30s, but looked and acted much older. The boss, as we called him, had a diabetic red nose and no upper teeth except one fang. Yet there was a gentle sweetness about his face. He had a ridiculous grin that exposed prodigiously his one tooth. When short of an extra teacup, he would pick up an empty milk tin, rinse it and say, grinning, "How's this for one?" The other man, though agreeable, was quiet, sallow-faced, thick-lipped, and talked slowly. Around 1 o'clock the boss would look up at me. "Have you ever tasted Welsh rarebit made of cheese rinds?" "We've had it many times," I replied. Then with a chortle and a grin he would give me 2 pence, and I would go to Asher's, the tea grocer's on the corner, who liked me and always gave me a lot for my money, and buy a penny worth of cheese rinds and a penny worth of bread. After washing and scraping the cheese he would add water and a little salt and pepper. Sometimes the boss would throw in a piece of bacon fat and a sliced onion, which together with a can of hot tea made a very appetizing meal. Although I never asked for money, at the end of the week the boss gave me 6 pence, which was a pleasant surprise. Joe, the sallow-faced one, suffered from fits, and the boss would burn brown paper under his nose to bring him to. Sometimes he would foam at the mouth and bite his tongue, and when he recovered would look pathetic and ashamed. The woodchoppers worked from 7 in the morning until 7 at night, sometimes later, and I always felt sad when they locked up the shed and went home. One night the boss decided to treat us to a 2-penny gallery seat at the South London Music Hall. Joe and I were already washed and cleaned up, waiting for the boss. I was thrilled because Fred Karno's comedy Early Birds, the company I joined later, was playing there that week. Joe was leaning against the wall of the mews and I was standing opposite him, enthusiastic and excited, when suddenly he let out a roar and slid down sideways against the wall in one of his fits. The anticipation had been too much. The boss wanted to stay and look after him, but when Joe came out of his fit he insisted that the two of us go without him and that he would be all right in the morning. The threat of school was an ogre that never left me. Once in a while the wood choppers would question me about it. They became a little uneasy when the holidays were over, so I would stay away from them until 4:30, when school was let out. But it was a long, lonely day in the glare of incriminating streets, waiting until 4:30 to get back to my shadow retreat and the wood choppers. While I was creeping up to bed one night, the landlady called me. She had been sitting up, waiting. She was all excited and handed me a telegram. It read, "Will arrive 10 o'clock tomorrow morning at Waterloo Station. Love, Sydney." I was not an imposing sight to greet him at the station. My clothes were dirty and torn. My shoes yawned, and the lining of my cap showed like a woman's dropping underskirt. And what face washing I did was at the woodchopper's tap, because it saved me having to carry a pail of water up 3 flights of stairs and past the landlady's kitchen. When I met Sydney, the shades of night were in my ears and around my neck. Looking me over, he said, "What's happened?" I did not break the news too gently. "Mother went insane and we had to send her to the infirmary." His face clouded, but he checked himself. "Where are you living?" "The same place, Pall Mall Terrace." He turned away to look after his baggage. I noticed he looked pale and gaunt. He ordered a brougham, and the porters piled his luggage on top of it. Among other things, a crate of bananas. "Is that ours?" I asked eagerly. He nodded. "They're too green. We'll have to wait a day or so before we can eat them." On the way home, he began asking questions about Mother. I was too excited to give him a coherent account, but he got snatches. Then he told me he had been left behind in a hospital at Cape Town for medical treatment, and that on the return trip he had made £20, money he looked forward to giving Mother. He had made it from the soldiers, organizing sweepstakes and lotteries. He told me of his plans. He intended giving up the sea and becoming an actor. He figured that the money would keep us for 20 weeks, in which time he would seek work in the theatre. Our arrival in a cab with a crate of bananas impressed both the neighbours and the landlady. She told Sydney about Mother, but did not go into harrowing details. The same day Sydney went shopping and outfitted me with new clothes, and that night, all dressed up, we sat in the stalls of the South London Music Hall. During the performance, Sydney kept repeating, "Just think what tonight would have meant to Mother." That week we went to Cane Hill to see her. As we sat in the visiting room, the ordeal of waiting became almost unbearable. I remember the keys turning and Mother walking in. She looked pale and her lips were blue, and although she recognized us, it was without enthusiasm. Her old ebullience had gone. She was accompanied by a nurse, an innocuous, glib woman, who stood and wanted to talk. "It's a pity you came at such a time," she said, "for we're not quite ourselves today, are we, dear?" Mother politely glanced at her and half smiled, as though waiting for her to leave. "You come again when we're a little more up the mark," added the nurse. Eventually she went, and we were left alone. Although Sydney tried to cheer Mother up, telling her of his good fortune and the money he had made and his reason for having been away so long, she just sat listening and nodding, looking vague and preoccupied. I told her that she would soon get well. "Of course," she said dolefully, "if only you had given me a cup of tea that afternoon, I would have been all right." The doctor told Sydney afterwards that her mind was undoubtedly impaired by malnutrition, and that she required proper medical treatment, and that, although she had lucid moments, it would be months before she completely recovered. But for days I was haunted by her remark, "If only you had given me a cup of tea, I would have been all right."